You're listening to CITR News Live, bringing you live interviews with local activists, politicians, and policy experts from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. I'm Arman Rana.
And I'm Isa Yu. It is Saturday, October 10th at 20:37, which is 8:37 p.m. And as you can see, we are not in the studio, but broadcasting from our various quarantine locations. So last week, we spoke to Tessica Trong, the NDP candidate for Vancouver-Langara for the upcoming BC elections.
Today, we're speaking to the incumbent and BC Liberal candidate Michael Lee for Vancouver-Langara.
Now, you might be wondering why the News Collective is so interested in Vancouver-Langara, and I personally think it's because they're the only ones that have responded to our emails.
That's what you would like to think, but actually, Vancouver-Langara is one of two potential battleground ridings in Vancouver, the other being Vancouver Falls Creek. And even though this one has been Liberal since its creation in 1991, it has been trending towards the NDP in recent years. Michael Lee won his last election by less than 10% of the vote. So what are the deets on Michael, Isaac?
So Michael Lee is a former business lawyer with 20 years of experience. He also worked as an assistant to former Prime Minister Kim Campbell in the 90s. After entering provincial politics in 2017, he ran for leadership of the BC Liberals on a message of broadening the appeal of the BC Liberals. Despite getting the most votes in each of the first four ballots, he ended up being eliminated based on points. Prior to that, he was elected as MLA for the Vancouver-Langara riding in 2017.
Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, thanks, Armin and Isaac, for having me on.
So could you start off by telling us a bit about yourself? Like, you had a successful career as a business lawyer. So why did you enter politics, and how have you been finding being an MLA so far?
So I would say that my interest in public service started actually at UBC. And actually before that, when I worked with Youth at Risk in the mid-1980s as a volunteer on the downtown east side, I ran Saturday and Sunday morning programs at Britannia. And at that time, many young people were finding ways to integrate into Canadian society. I was on a National Youth Advisory Committee and International Year of the Youth in 1985 and traveled across Canada working on youth issues. I worked on head tax redress to address the racial injustice of preventing and restricting people of Asian descent from entering our country. And I served on the Success Immigrant Service Board in the late 80s. During that time, I transitioned. I finished my first degree in cell biology at UBC. I went into political science. I became the treasurer of the Political Science Students Association. I went from there as AMS rep, arts president, and became the AMS president. And that's, as we were mentioning before the interview started, my interaction with CITR on a weekly Friday afternoon radio station. I think I obviously learned a lot, learning about service in those years. As Isaac mentioned, I went on to work for Kim Campbell when she was the first female Minister of Justice, breaking down other barriers for women in so many different ways, including with respect to the rape shield law. We went on and went into law school at UVic. And so all of that history for me is about how do you bring about impact and bring the community together more in a balanced way, in a less polarized way. And we've seen in British Columbia such a polarized fight between the left and the center and the right. And, you know, I think that there's a lot of noise, and we need to continue to strengthen the kind of leadership we have at all levels of government for any political party, and encourage young people to come forward like Tessica, certainly, as I was when I was younger, and also look to how we can restore some confidence in who we elect, because these are very challenging times. And we're all looking for leadership, particularly in COVID-19 times as well.
Yeah, so speaking of the pandemic, how would a BC Liberal government have handled or be handling this pandemic differently?
You know, I think that there were certainly important measures that were taken to to bring about and deal with the challenges of a very uncertain COVID-19 in terms of how to deal with it, prevent the spread of it, whether it's through social distance or wearing masks. Certainly we've seen that within senior care facilities, amongst younger people. So as you may well recognize, Andrew Wilkinson, the BC Liberal team, of which I'm part of, took a very nonpartisan approach, particularly at the beginning of this crisis, as Andrew said, to fight the disease and not fight each other. And certainly that was there for the first number of months. We also joined together with to support the emergency measures. I debated any of those emergency protections, amendments to the Emergency Program Act, the powers of government. I've been the justice critic up until just before the snap election here. But in terms of the budgetary items, the $1.5 billion program that this government had support from the other parties, the Green Party and the BC Liberal Party, you know, that was the path that we were on. And I think a government at this time, when you're looking at a worldwide global pandemic, needs to be focused on governing. And it's very regrettable and very unfortunate that John Horgan and the NDP called an election in the middle of a pandemic when they didn't have to. We have a fixed term election date for elections, and that would have been October 2021. The Greens were certainly still supporting this government. There was no reason to call this election early. And I think he's putting everything at risk, John Horgan is. And they've certainly lost focus, because when you call an election and you're asking all the parties to go campaign in a socially distanced way with masks on and all that sort of stuff, you're losing focus on what needs to be important in terms of how you manage the healthcare system, school reopenings, university students. My daughter is studying at UBC and doing it on Zoom and hybrid. I talked to students in high schools at Churchill and Eric Camber in my riding, and John Oliver and McGee, and they're all struggling with you know, they're furthering their education in a safe way. But I think that in terms of a BC Liberal government and what we're running on this election, which has 2 weeks left, it's gone by very fast, is to how do we balance the recovery? You know, certainly the immediate needs to give supports to people who are out of work, laid off, who can't work because you know, the tourism industry or the retail sector, areas that just have been significantly challenged by COVID-19. But we need to provide those supports, and certainly to frontline workers to keep them safe. They're doing a great job to help protect us all. But we also need to look after how do we recover from all of this. And we need to get the economy moving again. And that's been through measures which are bold, to eliminate PST for the first year, reduce it to 3% in the second year, and get things moving again, including for the economy and small businesses. And that includes eliminating the small business tax. I think that young drivers are continuing to struggle under ICBC. We need to introduce choice to stabilize insurance rates. Because as we see with young people, just, you know, who might have a car, $5,000, their insurance might cost $3,000 or $4,000. That's not sustainable. You know, we need to find ways to get people moving forward again, and we need a childcare program that actually works. It's not the $10 promise, a day promise that the NDP made before the last election, which really didn't get implemented. It didn't really create many spaces as they thought, you know, they could. And we need a more sustainable program, which is why Andrew Wilkinson yesterday introduced this tiered program, $10, $20, and $30 a day for daycare, depending on your income level. These are examples of the kinds of policies that I believe are more balanced, more sustainable, and a way to get our province moving forward in a stronger way.
Yeah, so speaking on like school and back to school, on your party's website, it states the NDP's current back to school plan is failing parents, teachers, and children by creating more confusion and uncertainty. So What did the NDP do that failed teachers? And given that the BC Liberals' history of protracted labour conflict with the BC Teachers Federation, why should voters trust the BC Liberals to take teachers' concerns seriously?
You know, we have a new leader in Andrew Wilkinson for the BC Liberal Party, and he, like I, have children who've gone through the public school system, and we recognize the importance of education. It's given us personally and our families much opportunity. And, you know, I think that the clearly for the BC Liberal Party going forward, we see very much the importance of the professional staff that we have working in our school system. Many are friends or family members, others that we recognize the impact that they have had on our children. So we need to continue to ensure that we have a school system that works for our families and our children. And I have a youth advisory council as an MLA that I have been hosting to work with students, including about mental health in the context of COVID, in the context of online learning, and the challenges of how we move forward. You know, I think that the NDP, quite frankly, they had many months to anticipate how schools reopen safely for elementary and high school students, for example. And I appreciate that COVID is a constantly changing battle. It's a dynamic situation. But as you would know, in June, students partially went back to school. That was supposed to be a bit of a test. It was supposed to give information to the Vancouver School Board and the other school districts around this province, the Ministry of Education, and it did. It tested a few different approaches, and then the Ministry of Education had the summer months to come up with a better plan as to how to safely reopen schools. And those plans constantly changed. A, there wasn't a plan. B, it was delayed. And C, it changed. And so it left various school districts having to scramble. And difference in approaches. You know, we have a province here that every child in our province ought to have the same educational opportunity. And there are different learning outcomes. People who are in grade 12 who are trying to apply to UBC or SFU or Langara College in my riding, they're all having a slightly different experience online or in the classroom. We all want to keep, clearly, our students safe. But I know that in talking to parents and families and students even, in August and September in particular, there was much anxiety, lack of clarity, lack of communication, lack of certainty, and it didn't have to be that way. Somehow between the Ministry of Education and the school districts, I think the school districts are just trying to do their job. They're definitely orchestrating and arranging for all the schools across Vancouver, for example. I've had my discussions with the chair of the Vancouver School Board and the superintendent, Suzanne Hoffman. They're certainly adapting as much as they can on the fly, but the Ministry of Education really restricted and made it very difficult for those families who were concerned about family members who are immunocompromised, children perhaps who and families didn't feel comfortable going back to school yet. They weren't really given much choice because there isn't the online platforms, homeschooling and the supports for remote learning that there should be in this province. We should have more choice, and you shouldn't have to give up your place in school if you take one of those choices, because this is a very strong challenge. It's a daunting challenge. And so I think the Ministry of Education under Minister Fleming and the NDP government, they failed in this. They failed in this leadership. And the NDP, as you know, the BCTF, of course, expressed much concern about the safety of teachers and staff. And those concerns still go on. So I think that you know, we need to make sure that we have a strong relationship between government and our teaching profession. And I'm sure that under a BC Liberal government, we will have that.
I'm a bit curious what the BC Liberals have in their plan to move forward.
Thank you for that question. You know, it's a short campaign. It's a snap election. And I think that I mentioned, first of all, the PST elimination for 1 year and the reduction to 3% in the second year. That is a temporary measure. It's a measure to move forward. It will cost the Treasury quite a bit, but it is something that we feel in the face of COVID and getting the economy moving again for small businesses in particular and others, families that are struggling. It helps, in a 7% kind of way to lower costs of living and buying of goods. I think that we've seen, and this is something I focused on in my riding, ensuring that our parents and grandparents can live longer in our communities with home care as they may need it as they age. So there's a $7,000 seniors home care tax credit for expenses of home care. That's an example, and certainly, we've seen the NDP and the BC Liberals have put forward significant programs to strengthen the infrastructure for senior care facilities, to have the single room so that, with COVID, of course, we've seen a lot of challenge in people whose lives have passed away, of course, because of COVID, given the aging facilities that we have. I think that I've talked about ICBC and introducing more choice and lowering the cost. We have the highest insurance costs in Canada, and certainly young drivers, it's been a big barrier. So we need to introduce choice to lower those costs. Certainly in terms of infrastructure build, housing is a very important area. We need to continue to increase the supply and the mix of housing, family and rental housing, including in my riding along Cambie, around the Oak Ridge Town Center. That should have been done before with the City of Vancouver and the Province of British Columbia. We should have tied more strings to, when you invest in transit infrastructure, you need to have the right mix of housing around that transit infrastructure. So I've certainly been advocating for that. And, with the BC Liberals, there's an $8 billion program, for example, to build the George Massey tunnel replacement. The bridge that should have been built would have been built halfway by now and would have saved us $900 million if not for the politics of the NDP. These are some examples of what the BC Liberal Party is coming forward with, and you'll see the balance of these policies before the leadership debate next Tuesday on October 13th.
Yeah, I was wondering, Isa, was that your question particularly with regards to education, or were you speaking more broadly?
I was speaking about education.
Yeah, but I think it's time to move to another topic because we spent some time with that. So
yeah, that's all right. So speaking of healthcare, the opioid epidemic has accelerated during this pandemic, with 909 overdose deaths as of the 2nd of September, according to BBC. And so what strategies should the province be looking at to address this?
The opioid crisis has been one that has been there certainly before COVID. It's been exacerbated in these tougher times, particularly with some of the continued supply that's been very detrimental to those who are addicted. Clearly we need more supports. Andrew Wilkinson, as you know, is someone who has a medical background as a physician. Jane Thornwaite, the MLA for North Vancouver Seymour, has been our critic for mental health and addiction. Both Andrew and Jane have been talking for some time over the last, number of years about the importance to take a compassion approach and to provide the supports, particularly to give people a path to recovery. It's not just about supply, it's about how do we continue to work with people so that they have the necessary opportunities to seek assistance and support on a path to recovery if possible. I think that certainly when we look at what we've seen in the community with those who are homeless, people who are suffering from a combination of challenges of mental health and addiction on our streets, Andrew has come forward with a very strong community safety plan to provide more supports, because it's no more than just about providing shelter or housing in a temporary way. We need to provide more wraparound services, because when we don't, and when this government, the NDP government, has failed to do so, we had all sorts of challenges, not just for those people who are challenged in this way and they're suffering with their lives, but also in our neighborhoods and our communities. And so there's a necessary balance that we need to strike here. And I think certainly for all of the dedication and all of the well intentions of this government, it hasn't gotten any better. It's gotten worse, in fact.
So switching gears a bit here, the BC Liberals first, so moving to the environment, the BC Liberals first introduced the carbon tax over a decade ago, before any other jurisdiction in Canada. The BC NDP planned to comply with the federal government mandated increase to $50 a ton 1 year early by 2021. On the BC Liberals website, it states that, quote, with the carbon tax increase to $50 per ton by April 2021, BC residents will be left with a substantial bill to heat their homes with natural gas. Are the BC Liberals now against increasing the carbon tax to comply with federal regulations a year early? Or could you just clarify, like, what is the position of the BC Liberals with regard to the carbon tax?
Well, I think what you're going to see is a continued focus on how do we move forward to protect our environment. The BC Liberal Party has had a strong leadership role in that, with the carbon tax being, when Gordon Campbell introduced that in British Columbia, we were the first jurisdiction in North America to do that. So British Columbia has been a leader. And I know that with Andrew Wilkinson and his leadership, he will be coming out with our policy on the environment. And I think you'll find it to be very compelling. And you'll see that in the coming days before the leadership debate, as I mentioned. But clearly with Andrew's background and his viewpoint, you know, he spent a lot of time around British Columbia. And he has a real dedicated view of that to ensure that there's the right balance to protect our lands, our waters, the lands inhabited by the traditional territories of First Nations here in this province. So we need to work together, of course, certainly. And I think you'll see that come forward in the coming days.
I see. So I guess we have to stay tuned for that. So coming to housing, and again from your website, it states that the BC Liberals will replace the NDP's, quote, phony speculation tax with a pre-sale condo flipping tax. Just for our listeners and viewers, the speculation and vacancy tax introduced a 0.5% tax on empty homes in order to curb speculation and encourage owners to rent out their homes. Why are the BC Liberals against this tax? And could you just explain a bit more about how this pre-sale condo flipping tax would work?
You know, I think that what we've seen from the NDP is over the last 3.5 years, 23 new or increased taxes with $6 billion of additional tax burden in different ways. What Andrew and the BC Liberal Party have talked about is, you know, certainly we have concerns in ensuring that there is continued supply of housing. And that's working with the cities, building the infrastructure necessary to, you know, from here out to the Fraser Valley, so that we have more choices and that we speed up the pace of development. But in terms of speculation, you know, the NDP have labeled so many different things in so many different ways. And if the main point about this, if we're talking about speculation, we should be going after those who are flipping pre-sale contracts on condos, apartments in a way that really is not adding any value to our housing market. So Andrew himself had introduced a private members bill to address that. This government didn't entertain that. So that's what he's speaking about when he talks about the mechanism that we should be using to deal with speculation.
My turn now. So according to the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, approximately 10% of the Canadian population identifies as LGBTQ. By some estimates, LGBTQ youth make up between 25 and 40% of homeless youth in Canada. In this climate of housing discrimination towards LGBTQ community, until very recently, the BC Liberals frequently advertised and wrote columns in the anti-LGBTQ magazine The Light. You yourself were a part of an ad spread last year on The Light. And so if there are still members of your party who are not fully committed to the full and equal rights of this community, should voters expect you to enforce and extend basic rights and protections for them if elected?
Yes, absolutely, 100%. Andrew Wilkinson, the entire BC Liberal Caucus will enforce equal rights for all in British Columbia, regardless of gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, special abilities. There is no room for any form of discrimination in our BC Liberal Caucus. Andrew Wilkinson's been very clear on that. No candidate who is running in our BC Liberal team, if they hold any views contrary to that, there is no place for them on our team. Andrew's been very clear on that. He's been very clear on that when that concern came out. So I know that in my community, we need to continue to work to ensure that we have an inclusive community. And we have intersectionalities between those who are Asian, for example, and members of the LGBTQ community. And I recognize that there are ways that we need to continue to work through systemic racism and bias. And Andrew has family members who are members of the LGBTQ community, and I don't think people really truly understand that or recognize that about Andrew. Andrew certainly is a progressive person. And will always fight for equal rights, as I will.
So speaking on that, we also talked about education a bit earlier. And so in a CBC article, I think in 2018, the topic of the education curriculum, and with that, like the talk of gender and sexuality, and you had mentioned that it would be something to consider to allow parents to withdraw students from those programs or programs that teach these curriculums. Do you still hold that same stance?
The importance, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I think that as we look at our educational system, that we need to ensure that as we work with teachers and staff members, that we have environments that are certainly against bullying and discrimination of any form. And certainly as our students look at equality, equity, and diversity, that we have that general understanding of that. But we also recognize that families and parents have a role in how their children are being raised, and they have a voice in that too. It's a partnership. It's not just the responsibility of the educational system, it's also the responsibility of families as well. So I think that as we look at our educational system, my wife was certainly involved as a class parent and involved with, previously on the PAC for my children's preschool. We have lots of examples where parents are involved in the education of the children, helping out with in the classroom or supporting schools. And that's the important partnership that we have. And so when parents have concerns, they should be addressed, and there should be understanding about that. We need to find a better way. And so I think that that is a necessary discussion to be having. But certainly, I think we all recognize that we need to continue to develop citizens in schools, boys and girls, that recognize the need for equality, the need for equity and inclusion, and that there is no place for discrimination in the classroom or bullying on the school grounds. And so that's where I think, I know that my children certainly benefited from attending Lord Kitchener Elementary School, and they became good citizens of our community.
Yeah, I think I just wanted, before we wrap up, we've covered a wide variety of topics. Is there something that, that is an important issue that you feel that we haven't adequately addressed, or an important distinction or contrast that you want to make, between the two, primarily two options that voters are facing?
Well, thanks, Armin, for that question too. And I appreciate the questions you've raised here on this interview. I know the importance of students who are involved in student government or in student media, as you are. They're very important roles. And it's important to look at everything with a critical eye. And, I think we all have the same intentions of a better world. And we have all our roles to play. I have children now in their 20s, and I get the fact that we all are concerned about the environment. We're concerned about equality. We're concerned about our future paths. And, I think that what happens in politics, whether it's being in student politics or working federally as a political staffer or now as an elected official provincially, there's a lot of noise out there, a lot of noise. And, I think that it's important that, and I appreciate there's a journey here for everybody's young person in life as to looking at the world around us. And, but there is a lot of noise. And I think it's important with the noise that you do what you're doing, which is looking at things with a critical eye, because there's a lot of packaging, there's a lot of polarization. And I think it's important to work through that, to recognize the individual who is standing for office, to recognize their policies and their platforms, and whether they're short-sighted, short-term, words that are just there to get your support and work on the next election. I do think that there's certainly a level of responsibility in terms of that everyone needs to have here as citizens, and even in elected office. And so I think that has always been something I've aspired to, and I think as we go forward, it is something that we all need to focus on. And so I hope that as your listeners consider their choices, they consider them carefully, and they hopefully give candidates who they might hear, or they might see, they might read about, an opportunity to put themselves forward, regardless of what their party label might be.
Yeah, so that brings us to an end of today's live stream.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
To close, you can find us on CITR News on Instagram and Twitter, so check us out there.
Could I have it for